It was a quiet evening at the small airstrip just outside of Chicago. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple across the sky. A gentle breeze rustled through the tall grass near the hangar, where a lone Cessna 172 sat ready for takeoff. Its pilot stood beside it, inspecting every detail with practiced precision. The man wasn't flashy or loud. He carried himself with a calmness that came from years of experience. He'd spent most of his life around planes, first in uniform, as part of the U.S. Air Force, then later as an instructor teaching others how to fly. Flying wasn't just his job. It was his passion, his escape. But tonight, something felt off. As he walked around the plane doing his pre-flight checks, his eyes caught sight of a black van parked a little too close to the hangar. It wasn't unusual for people to visit the airstrip, but this vehicle seemed out of place. The windows were tinted, and no one stepped out. Still, he shook off the feeling. Maybe it belonged to one of the maintenance crew who'd forgotten something inside. Or maybe it was nothing at all. Either way, he couldn't let it distract him now. He climbed into the cockpit and started the engine. The familiar hum of the propeller spinning up filled the air, and soon enough the plane was taxiing toward the runway. As he glanced back once more before taking off, he noticed two figures standing near the van, watching him intently. Their faces were hidden under baseball caps, and they didn't move as the plane roared down the runway and lifted into the sky. At first, everything seemed normal. The lights of the city faded away beneath him, replaced by the dark expanse of fields and forests. Up here, thousands of feet above the ground, the world always felt peaceful. But peace has a way of being short-lived when you least expect it. About 10 minutes into the flight, the tranquility shattered. From the rear cabin, 3 men emerged suddenly, their faces covered with masks. Each held a handgun, its barrel glinting ominously in the dim light of the cockpit. One of them, the leader judging by the way he carried himself, stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "Don't try anything stupid," the man said, his tone icy. "Land this thing right now or we'll make sure you regret it." For a moment, time froze. The pilot's heart pounded in his chest, but outwardly he remained composed. Years of training kicked in instantly. This wasn't the first time he'd faced danger, though usually it involved enemy forces overseas, not armed thugs on a tiny civilian aircraft. His mind raced, analyzing the situation like a chess player planning his next move. He raised his hands slowly, showing he meant no immediate harm. Okay, he replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Just tell me where you want me to go." The leader smirked beneath his mask, clearly satisfied with the response. "We'll give you coordinates once we're clear of radar. For now, head west." The other 2 men spread out, keeping their guns trained on the pilot. They clearly knew what they were doing, or at least thought they did. What they didn't know was that the man sitting in the pilot's seat wasn't just some ordinary guy. Beneath the surface of his calm demeanor lay decades of experience, discipline, and resourcefulness. And while they might have planned this, hijacking carefully, they hadn't accounted for one crucial detail. Their hostage was far more dangerous than he appeared. As the plane continued westward, the pilot kept his focus sharp. Every twitch of the controls, every adjustment to altitude was deliberate. On the outside, he played the role of a frightened victim perfectly. Inside, however, his mind was already working on a plan. These men had made a grave mistake by choosing him. Little did they know, they were about to find themselves in a fight they couldn't possibly win. The tension in the cockpit grew thicker with each passing minute. The leader barked orders occasionally, trying to assert dominance, but the pilot barely reacted. Instead, he listened closely, memorizing every word, every movement. Somewhere deep inside, a spark ignited, a mix of determination and anger. These men weren't going to ruin his night, or worse, hurt anyone else. Not if he had anything to say about it. And so, high above the earth, surrounded by darkness and danger, the stage was set for a battle of wits and wills. The pilot may have been outnumbered, but he wasn't outmatched, not by a long shot. The leader of the group, a wiry man with cold eyes and a voice that dripped with authority, leaned closer to the pilot. His mask hid his face, but there was no mistaking the menace in his tone. "You're gonna do exactly what we say," he growled. "No funny business. Got it?" The pilot nodded slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't want to provoke them further, not yet. His mind raced as he processed every word they said, piecing together their plan. From what little they'd revealed so far, it seemed these men weren't just random criminals, they were professionals. Smugglers, maybe. Or worse. "We've got a job to do," the leader continued, gesturing toward one of his accomplices to keep an eye on the controls. "And you're gonna help us finish it. If you cooperate, you walk away alive. Screw this up and—" He let the threat hang in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. The pilot kept his gaze fixed ahead, pretending to focus on flying while secretly studying the men around him. They were tense. Too tense. Their hands gripped their weapons tightly, fingers twitching against the triggers. These guys weren't used to things going wrong, and that made them unpredictable. Dangerous. One of the hijackers, a burly man with a scar running down his neck, stood behind the pilot, pressing the barrel of his gun against the back of the seat. "Keep your hands where I can see 'em," he snapped, his voice rough and impatient. The pilot obeyed without hesitation, raising his hands slightly off the controls before returning them to make minor adjustments. Every movement was calculated, designed to look compliant while buying himself precious seconds to think. As the minutes dragged on, the leader finally spoke again. "All right, here's the deal. We need this plane to land at a specific spot. Remote, no cops, no witnesses. You screw this up and you're dead. Understand?" The pilot nodded again, his expression carefully neutral. Inside, though, his mind was working overtime. Landing at some remote airstrip? That didn't sound good. Whatever cargo these men were carrying, and whatever illegal operation they were running, it was big enough to warrant such extreme measures. And if he landed the plane at their chosen location, there was no telling what would happen next. Would they let him go? Or would they silence him forever? He couldn't afford to find out. "Got it," he replied, his voice even. "But listen, I'm not exactly sure how much fuel we've got left. If we don't refuel soon, we might run into trouble." It was a lie, of course. He knew the plane's fuel levels perfectly well, but planting seeds of doubt in their minds could buy him time, and possibly create opportunities to turn the tables. The leader frowned, clearly suspicious. "What do you mean, not sure? Didn't you check before takeoff?" "I did," the pilot said quickly, injecting just enough nervousness into his tone to sell the act. "But sometimes the gauges aren't totally accurate, and with all this unexpected activity—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The second hijacker, a wiry guy with restless energy, exchanged a glance with the leader. "Maybe he's lying," he muttered, "trying to stall us." "No," the leader shot back sharply. "He's too scared for that, right?" He turned his piercing gaze back to the pilot, who swallowed hard and nodded. "Right," the pilot confirmed. "I'm just telling you what I know. If we push the plane too far, we could end up stranded or worse." For a moment, none of them spoke. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, pressing down on everyone like a weight. Finally, the leader sighed and waved a hand dismissively. "Fine, we'll figure it out later. Just keep heading west for now." Relieved, but careful not to show it, the pilot adjusted the plane's course slightly. As he did, he allowed himself a brief mental replay of his military days. Back then, he'd faced situations far more intense than this. Enemy fire, mechanical, failures, split-second decisions that meant life or death. He'd been trained to stay calm under pressure, to think several steps ahead of his opponents. Those skills hadn't faded. If anything, they'd sharpened over the years. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A mission overseas during a particularly chaotic operation. His unit had been ambushed, outnumbered, and outgunned. Most would have panicked, but he'd stayed focused, using every trick he'd learned to outmaneuver the enemy. By the time reinforcements arrived, the tables had turned completely. Thinking back on it now gave him a strange sense of reassurance. If he could survive that, he could survive this. The hijackers, meanwhile, seemed increasingly uneasy. The burly man with the scar kept shifting his weight, glancing nervously between the pilot and the horizon. The wiry guy muttered something under his breath about weather patterns, though none of them really understood aviation jargon. Even the leader, who tried to project confidence, couldn't hide the faint edge of uncertainty in his posture. They were amateurs compared to him. Sure, they had guns, but beyond that, they were relying purely on intimidation. And intimidation only worked if the person being intimidated actually believed they were powerless. The pilot wasn't about to let them win that psychological battle, so he ventured cautiously, breaking the silence. What exactly are we transporting here? Just curious. The leader's eyes narrowed dangerously. That's none of your concern. Fair enough, the pilot said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Just trying to understand the situation better. Helps me anticipate any complications. There was a beat of silence, and then the leader smirked. Smart move. Asking questions like that makes you seem less like a liability. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But trust me, you don't want to know what's in the back. Focus on flying and maybe you'll live long enough to forget this ever happened. The pilot forced a weak smile, nodding again. Understood. Inside, however, his resolve hardened. Forget it? Not a chance. Whoever these men were, whatever they were smuggling, they weren't getting away with it. Not on his watch. For now, though, he played along, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, biding his time. As the plane soared through the night sky, the pilot's mind churned with possibilities. Every adjustment to the controls, every subtle change in altitude was part of a larger strategy. He wasn't just flying anymore. He was setting the stage for a counterattack. These men thought they held all the cards, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. And when the moment came, they'd realize their mistake far too late. The pilot's hands moved with practiced ease over the controls, but his mind was anything but relaxed. Every adjustment he made, every slight dip in altitude or subtle shift in direction, was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. On the surface, he appeared compliant, even nervous, but beneath that calm exterior, he was calculating, strategizing, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. The hijackers, for their part, were growing increasingly agitated. The burly man with the scar kept pacing back and forth between the cockpit and the rear cabin, peering out the windows as if expecting trouble at any second. The wiry one muttered under his breath about fuel levels and weather conditions, though it was clear he didn't fully understand what he was talking about. Even the leader, who had seemed so confident earlier, now looked uneasy. His eyes darted constantly between the pilot and the horizon, searching for something, anything, that might explain why things weren't going exactly according to plan. "Why are we still climbing?" the leader barked suddenly, pointing at the altimeter. "I told you to head west, not up." The pilot glanced at him briefly, then returned his focus to the controls. "Wind patterns," he explained calmly, injecting just enough hesitation into his voice to sound unsure. "If I don't adjust for them, we could drift off course. Trust me, this is the fastest way to get where you want to go." The leader frowned but didn't argue. Instead, he leaned closer, his gun resting casually against his thigh. "Don't try anything clever," he warned. "We're watching your every move." "I'm not trying anything," the pilot replied, keeping his tone soft and deferential. "Just doing my job." But inside he smiled grimly. They thought they were in control, but they were wrong. Every tiny deviation from their intended route brought them closer to his trap. The hijacker's lack of aviation knowledge worked in his favor. They couldn't tell the difference between necessary adjustments and deliberate maneuvers designed to throw them off balance. And the longer they stayed in the air, the more opportunities he had to turn the situation around. As the plane continued its journey, the pilot decided it was time to push a little harder. He reached for the radio, pretending to check frequencies. "Static's getting worse," he said aloud, shaking his head. "Could be interference from the storm clouds ahead." "Storm clouds?" The wiry guy echoed nervously, glancing out the window. "What storm clouds?" "See for yourself," the pilot said, gesturing toward the windshield. Sure enough, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, illuminated faintly by distant lightning flashes. It wasn't a full-blown storm, not yet, but it was enough to make the hijackers uneasy. "We can't fly through that," the wiry one exclaimed, panic creeping into his voice. "We'll crash!" No, we'll be fine," the pilot reassured him, injecting a note of forced optimism into his tone. "But we'll need to adjust our course slightly to avoid the worst of it. Otherwise—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The leader scowled, clearly torn between suspicion and desperation. "Fine," he snapped after a moment. "Adjust the course, but don't try anything funny." "Wouldn't dream of it," the pilot replied smoothly, making the necessary changes. In reality, the detour would take them farther away from the hijackers' intended destination and closer to areas patrolled by law enforcement. But the hijackers didn't know that. All they saw was a scared pilot doing his best to keep them safe. The tension in the cockpit grew thicker with each passing minute. The burly man paced faster, his footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. The wiry guy muttered curses under his breath, clutching his gun like a lifeline. Even the leader, who had seemed so unshakable earlier, now looked rattled. Their confidence was slipping, and the pilot knew it. Finally, the moment came. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting everyone inside. The wiry guy stumbled, dropping his gun in the process. Before anyone could react, the pilot sprang into action. Years of military training kicked in as he twisted sideways, grabbing the fallen weapon before the wiry guy could recover it. In one fluid motion, he swung the butt of the gun upward, catching the burly man square in the jaw. The impact sent him sprawling backward, dazed and disoriented. "What the hell?" the leader shouted, raising his own weapon, but the pilot was already moving, using the narrow confines of the cockpit to his advantage. He ducked low, avoiding the leader's wild shot, and drove his shoulder into the man's stomach, knocking him off balance. The two men crashed to the floor, grappling for control of the gun. For a brief, terrifying moment, chaos reigned. The wiry guy scrambled to retrieve his weapon, but the pilot kicked it out of reach before turning his attention back to the leader. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he disarmed the man, sending the gun skittering across the floor. Then, with a well-placed punch, he knocked the leader unconscious. Breathing heavily, the pilot turned to face the wiry guy, who was frozen in place, wide-eyed with fear. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice cold and steady. After a moment's hesitation, the wiry guy obeyed, letting his weapon clatter to the floor. With the immediate threat neutralized, the pilot quickly secured the hijackers, using seatbelt straps to bind their wrists behind their backs. The burly man groaned as he came to, glaring daggers but unable to do anything more than curse under his breath. The wiry guy trembled visibly, his bravado completely gone. As for the leader, he lay slumped against the wall, out cold. The pilot allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before returning his focus to flying. He adjusted the plane's course once more, steering it toward an area where he knew authorities would be nearby. Then, using the radio, he sent out a coded distress signal, a series of clicks and static bursts that only trained pilots and air traffic controllers would recognize. Help was on the way. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pilot took a deep breath, letting the quiet hum of the engine soothe his racing thoughts. He'd been in tight spots before, but this one had been particularly intense. Still, he reminded himself of something he'd learned long ago. Fear was natural, but it couldn't be allowed to control you. You had to push through it, think clearly, and trust your instincts. Looking at the three men tied up in the back, he felt a mix of emotions: anger, relief, and a strange sort of pity. These guys had made their choices, and now they'd have to face the consequences. But for him, the fight wasn't over yet. There was still work to do, decisions to make, and people to protect. And as the plane soared through the night sky, heading toward safety and justice, the pilot knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, he'd be ready. With the hijackers neutralized and tied up in the rear cabin, the pilot turned his full attention back to flying. He adjusted the plane's course once more, steering it toward an area he knew would put him within range of law enforcement. The adrenaline that had fueled his earlier actions was starting to ebb, leaving behind a mix of exhaustion and determination. His hands moved steadily over the controls, guiding the aircraft with the precision of someone who'd spent years mastering their craft. The sky outside was dark now, dotted with stars that seemed impossibly far away. Below, the landscape stretched out in shadowy patches, fields, forests, and the occasional cluster of lights marking small towns. Somewhere down there, people were going about their lives, completely unaware of the drama unfolding thousands of feet above them. It was strange, the pilot thought, how life could feel so ordinary when danger loomed just overhead. As he flew, his mind replayed the events of the past hour. The initial shock of the hijacking, the tense standoff in the cockpit. The moment he'd decided to fight back, it all felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But this wasn't fiction. It was real. And while he'd managed to gain the upper hand for now, he knew the situation was far from resolved. These men weren't amateurs. They were desperate, dangerous, and likely connected to something bigger than just this one flight. Whoever they worked for wouldn't take kindly to failure. The leader groaned faintly in the background, stirring awake. The wiry guy muttered curses under his breath, tugging futilely at the seatbelt straps binding his wrists. The burly man sat, slumped against the wall, glaring daggers but saying nothing. None of them posed an immediate threat anymore, but the pilot kept one eye on them as he worked. Complacency could get you killed, especially in situations like this. "Where are we going?" The leader growled, his voice hoarse. "You think you're clever, don't you?" The pilot glanced at him briefly before returning his focus to the controls. "Clever enough to stop you," he replied evenly, "and smart enough to know you're not walking away from this." The leader sneered but didn't respond. Instead, he leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes as if trying to conserve energy. Whatever plan he'd been banking on had clearly gone sideways, and now he was biding his time, waiting for another opportunity to strike. But the pilot wasn't about to give him one. Every move he made was deliberate, calculated to keep the hijackers off balance while ensuring the plane stayed safe. He checked the fuel gauge again, confirming they had enough to reach his intended destination. Then he adjusted the altitude, slightly aiming for a smoother descent path once they were closer to landing. A sudden burst of static crackled over the radio, startling everyone, including the pilot. For a moment he froze, wondering if the hijackers had somehow triggered some kind of emergency signal, but then he realized what it was: a response from air traffic control. They'd picked up his distress call. "This is Chicago Center," came the voice on the other end, calm but firm. "Unidentified aircraft, please state your location and status." The pilot hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. He couldn't risk tipping off the hijackers that help was on the way, but he also needed to confirm his position without raising suspicion. "Chicago Center, this is November 35 Echo," he said, using the plane's registration number. "Experiencing minor turbulence near Rockford, requesting updated weather conditions." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a reply. "Copy that, November 35 Echo, stand by for updates." The message was coded, a subtle acknowledgement that they understood the situation and were mobilizing resources. The pilot exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. Backup was coming. Behind him, the wiry guy shifted uncomfortably. "What did you just do?" he demanded, his voice tinged with panic. "Who were you talking to?" "No one important," the pilot lied smoothly, keeping his tone casual. "Just checking the weather. Don't want us running into any storms, do we?" The wiry guy didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he exchanged a worried glance with the leader, who had opened his eyes again. Both men seemed to realize that things weren't going according to their original plan, not even close. Meanwhile, the pilot continued preparing for the next phase of his strategy. He scanned the horizon, looking for signs of approaching law enforcement. Helicopters, spotlights, or even distant sirens would indicate that authorities were closing in. For now, though, the night remained eerily quiet, save for the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of movement from the rear cabin. He decided to push the hijackers a little harder, testing their resolve. "You guys ever land a plane before?" he asked casually, glancing over his shoulder. The question caught them off guard. The burly man frowned, shaking his head. "Why? What's it matter?" "It matters because we're getting close to landing," the pilot explained, injecting a note of false concern into his voice. "And unless one of you knows how to handle this bird, we're going to have a problem." The three men exchanged uneasy glances. Clearly, none of them had expected this development. Landing a plane required skill and experience, things they clearly lacked. Panic began to creep into their expressions, and the pilot allowed himself a small inward smile. Doubt was a powerful weapon, and he intended to use it to his advantage. "You're bluffing," the leader snapped, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his tone. "You wouldn't risk crashing just to screw us over." "Maybe I wouldn't," the pilot admitted. "But accidents happen, don't they? Especially when you've got amateurs messing around in the cockpit." Leader clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "Don't try anything stupid," he warned. "We're still armed, remember?" "Sure," the pilot replied lightly. "But can you aim straight while strapped to a seatbelt? Because I'm pretty sure those cuffs aren't coming loose anytime soon." The remark drew a low growl from the burly man, but the leader silenced him with a sharp glare. "Enough," he barked. "Just focus on landing this thing." "Gladly," the pilot said, turning his attention back to the controls. Inwardly, he felt a surge of satisfaction. He'd planted the seed of doubt in their minds, making them question whether they could trust him or each other. That kind of psychological warfare was just as important as physical combat, especially in high-stakes situations like this. As the plane approached its intended destination, the pilot began final preparations for landing. He lowered the flaps, reduced speed, and lined up with the runway, a secluded airstrip surrounded by dense woods. It wasn't the hijackers' original target, but it would serve its purpose. Law enforcement would be lying in wait, ready to swoop in the moment the wheels touched down. The hijackers grew increasingly agitated as the ground came into view. The wiry guy started muttering prayers under his breath, while the burly man strained against his restraints, cursing loudly. Even the leader looked pale, his earlier bravado replaced by thinly veiled fear. "You'll regret this," he spat, glaring at the pilot. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I think I have a pretty good idea," the pilot replied, calmly. "And trust me, you're the ones who should be worried." With that, he guided the plane onto the runway, touching down smoothly despite the chaos in the cabin. As the engines wound down and the plane rolled to a stop, the hijackers braced themselves, expecting the worst. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, police cars, helicopters, and tactical teams converging on the scene. The pilot cut the engine and unbuckled his seatbelt, turning to face the men one last time. "Game over," he said, simply, meeting their eyes with steely resolve. Moments later, the door burst open and armed officers swarmed inside, taking custody of the hijackers. The leader shouted threats as he was dragged away, but the pilot barely registered them. He stepped out of the plane, breathing in the cool night air, feeling the weight of the evening's ordeal finally lift. It was over. But as he watched the flashing lights and heard the chatter of radios, he knew one thing for certain. The world was safer tonight because he'd chosen to act. The moment the plane's engines powered down, the silence inside the cabin was deafening. Outside, the night came alive with the sound of approaching vehicles, police cruisers screeching to a halt, the whirring blades of helicopters overhead, and the crunch of boots on gravel as officers surrounded the aircraft. The hijackers sat frozen, their earlier bravado replaced by sheer panic. Their eyes darted between each other and the pilot, who stood calmly near the cockpit, watching as law enforcement took control of the situation. "Stay where you are," came a loud voice from outside, amplified through a megaphone. "Hands visible at all times." The pilot raised his hands slightly, turning toward the open doorway to show he wasn't a threat. He knew the drill. It was standard procedure for SWAT teams to treat everyone as hostile until they could confirm otherwise. As spotlights illuminated the interior of the plane, he squinted against the glare, waiting patiently for instructions. "Step out slowly," one of the officers commanded, his weapon trained on the pilot. "Face away from the door." Doing exactly as instructed, the pilot moved carefully, keeping his movements deliberate and unhurried. Once outside, he felt the cool night air hit his face, a welcome relief after hours of tension in the cramped cockpit. Two officers immediately escorted him to a safe distance, asking rapid-fire questions to verify his identity and assess the situation. "What happened up there?" one of them asked, his tone urgent but controlled. The pilot took a deep breath before answering. "Three men hijacked the plane shortly after takeoff. They wanted me to land at a remote location, but I managed to neutralize them and redirect us here." The officer nodded, jotting notes onto a clipboard. "Are they armed?" "They were," the pilot replied, "but I disarmed two of them during the struggle. They're tied up in the rear cabin now." Behind him, shouts erupted as tactical teams boarded the plane. Moments later, the hijackers were dragged out one by one, their faces pale and streaked with sweat. The leader tried to resist, shouting threats and curses, but it was no use. Handcuffs clicked into place around their wrists, and within minutes, they were being loaded into separate police vehicles. As the chaos began to settle, another officer approached the pilot, a detective, judging by the badge clipped to his belt. His expression was calm but probing, the kind that suggested he'd seen it all before. "Mind walking me through what happened?" he asked, pulling out a small notebook. The pilot nodded, recounting the events step by step. He explained how the hijackers had surprised him mid-flight, their demands, and the way he'd used his training to outmaneuver them. He described the tense moments in the cockpit when he'd realized they weren't ordinary criminals. They were part of something bigger, possibly connected to organized crime or smuggling rings. And finally, he detailed the split-second decisions that had allowed him to regain control of the plane and send out a distress signal. The detective listened intently, occasionally nodding or scribbling notes. When the pilot finished, the detective closed his notebook and looked at him thoughtfully. "You did good," he said simply. "Real good. Most people would have frozen in a situation like that." "I didn't have much choice," the pilot admitted with a shrug. "They left me no room to negotiate, so I had to act." The detective chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Still, not everyone has the guts or the skills to pull off what you did tonight. You saved lives, including your own." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pilot glanced over at the parked police cars where the hijackers sat glaring daggers through the windows. Despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. These men were just pawns in a larger game, and whoever was pulling the strings wouldn't be happy about losing them. "You think they'll talk?" the pilot asked, nodding toward the vehicles. "About who sent them, I mean." The detective followed his gaze, his expression hardening. "They might. Guys like that usually crack under pressure once we dig a little deeper. But even if they don't, we'll find out who's behind this. Trust me, we don't let things like this slide." The pilot nodded, satisfied for now. Whatever came next, he trusted the authorities to handle it. His job was done, for tonight at least. As the scene continued to unfold, medics arrived to check on everyone involved. Though physically unharmed, the pilot accepted a bottle of water and sat down on the edge of the airstrip, letting the adrenaline drain from his system. Around him, officers worked efficiently, securing evidence from the plane and questioning witnesses who'd been monitoring the airspace during the hijacking. It was clear this operation had been planned meticulously, right down to the timing of the hijackers' ambush. One of the medics crouched beside him, shining a flashlight into his eyes to check for signs of shock. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. "I'm fine," he replied, managing a weak smile. "Just tired." She nodded knowingly. "That's normal after something like this. Take it easy for a while, okay? Your body's been through a lot." He thanked her and leaned back on his hands, staring up at the stars. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to relax, letting the quiet hum of activity wash over him. The world felt vast and peaceful again, untouched by the violence that had unfolded mere moments ago. It was strange how quickly life could shift, from chaos to calm, from danger to safety. A young officer approached him hesitantly, holding a clipboard. Sir, we need a formal statement from you before you leave. Just the basics, your name, contact info, and a brief summary of what happened." The pilot sighed inwardly but nodded. He understood the necessity of paperwork, even if it felt tedious after such an ordeal. Rising to his feet, he followed the officer to a nearby van set up as a temporary command center. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting harsh shadows across the makeshift desks and chairs. Another detective sat waiting, pen poised above a fresh sheet of paper. "Let's start with your name," the detective said, offering a reassuring smile. The pilot hesitated for a fraction of a second. Though he'd spent years blending into civilian life, he couldn't help but wonder how much of his past would come to light because of tonight. Still, there was no point hiding it now. If anything, his military background explained why he'd been able to handle the hijacking so effectively. "Former Air Force pilot," he said simply, meeting the detective's gaze. "I served overseas for several years before transitioning to teaching aviation." The detective's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Air Force, huh? That explains a lot. Guess you've dealt with situations like this before." "Not exactly. Like this," the pilot admitted with a wry smile. "But yeah, my training definitely helped." The detective jotted down a few more notes before leaning back in his chair. "Well, whatever your story is, you earned some serious respect tonight. People are going to hear about this one man taking down 3 armed hijackers. That's impressive, no matter how you slice it." The pilot shrugged modestly, though a flicker of pride warmed his chest. He hadn't acted out of a desire for recognition. He'd simply done what needed to be done. But hearing someone acknowledge his efforts made him feel human again. Not just a former soldier or a pilot, but a person who'd faced fear head-on and come out stronger on the other side. After wrapping up the interview, the pilot stepped back outside, breathing deeply. The sky was still dark, but hints of dawn were beginning to creep along the horizon, a reminder that even the longest nights eventually give way to daylight. Officers milled about, packing up equipment and discussing next steps. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed faintly, growing softer as the hijackers were transported to a nearby station for further questioning. The pilot lingered for a while longer, watching as the scene gradually returned to normalcy. Eventually, someone tapped him on the shoulder. It was the first detective he'd spoken to earlier. "We're good to go," the man said. "You're free to leave whenever you're ready. Just make sure to keep your phone handy in case we need to follow up." "Will do," the pilot replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "Thanks for everything." "No, thank you," the detective said earnestly. "We couldn't have pulled this off without you." With that, the pilot turned and walked toward his car, parked a short distance away. As he slid behind the wheel, he glanced back at the airstrip one last time. The flashing lights and bustling activity seemed almost surreal now, like remnants of a dream that was slowly fading away. He started the engine and pulled onto the road, heading home. Though exhausted, his mind remained sharp, replaying every detail of the night. He knew he'd remember this moment for the rest of his life, not because of the danger, but because of the choices he'd made. Choices that had kept others safe. Choices that reminded him of who he truly was. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, the pilot allowed himself a rare moment of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. After all, he'd already proven that fear wasn't something to run from, it was something to conquer. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clear, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of the suburbs. The pilot woke up later than usual, his body still heavy with exhaustion from the night before. He stretched slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles, a reminder of the physical toll the hijacking had taken on him. For a moment he lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over in his mind. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie rather than real life. Eventually, he dragged himself out of bed and made his way to the kitchen. Coffee was the first thing on his mind. The rich aroma filled the room as he poured himself a cup. Sitting at the table, he scrolled through his phone, checking for updates. News outlets were already buzzing about the incident. Headlines blared. Phrases like, "Hero pilot foils hijacking attempt," and "Former military officer saves lives." Photos of the plane surrounded by police cars accompanied the stories, though thankfully none included his face. He skimmed through a few articles, noting how reporters emphasized his quick thinking and bravery. One piece even quoted an aviation expert who called it a textbook example of crisis management. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. If only they knew just how close he'd come to losing control of the situation. Bravery wasn't always about being fearless, it was about acting despite the fear. And last night he'd been scared, terrified even. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that everyone was safe. As the day wore on, calls and messages began pouring in. Friends, colleagues, and former military buddies reached out to congratulate him or simply check in. Some expressed shock, others admiration, but all shared a sense of relief. One message stood out, a voicemail from an old commanding officer. "I heard what happened," the gruff voice said. "Proud of you, son, you haven't lost your edge." The words hit him harder than expected. Pride wasn't something he sought often, but hearing it from someone who'd once mentored him meant more than he could put into words. He saved the message, knowing he'd listen to it again someday when doubt crept in. By mid-afternoon, local authorities contacted him for a follow-up interview. They wanted to gather more details about the hijackers' operation, particularly their connection to larger criminal networks. Investigators believed these men were part of a smuggling ring specializing in high-value goods, stolen diamonds, according to early reports. Evidence found on the plane confirmed this, including hidden compartments stuffed with bags of glittering stones. "They underestimated you," one of the detectives said during the call. "Big mistake on their part." "Maybe," the pilot replied thoughtfully, "but it's not over yet. Whoever sent them won't stop just because they got caught." "We're working on that," the detective assured him. "Rest assured, we'll find whoever's pulling the strings. In the meantime, stay vigilant. These types don't take kindly to failure." The warning lingered in his mind long after the call ended. He knew better than anyone that criminals rarely operated alone. There would be repercussions. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. Still, he refused to let fear dictate his life. He'd faced danger before, and he'd do it again if necessary. Later that evening, he decided to visit the airstrip where the ordeal had begun. The place was eerily quiet now, devoid of flashing lights and shouting officers. A maintenance crew worked quietly nearby, inspecting damage to the hangar wall caused by one of the hijackers' clumsy attempts to break in. Seeing the familiar surroundings brought a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and a faint undercurrent of unease. As he walked along the runway, memories flooded back. The tense moments in the cockpit, the adrenaline-fueled fight, the relief of landing safely. It was impossible not to reflect on how quickly everything could change. One moment he'd been preparing for a routine flight. The next, he was fighting for his life. Life had a way of throwing curveballs, and sometimes the only thing you could do was adapt. A young woman approached him cautiously. It was one of the flight instructors who worked at the airstrip. She looked hesitant but clearly wanted to say something. "Hey, I'm sorry to bother you," she began, her voice soft. "But I just wanted to say thank you. We all heard what happened. You really saved the day." He smiled faintly, touched by her sincerity. "Just doing my job," he said simply. "No, it's more than that," she insisted. "Not everyone would have handled it the way you did. Honestly, I think a lot of us are looking at you differently now, not just as a pilot, but as someone we can trust completely." Her words stayed with him as he continued walking. Trust was a powerful thing, especially in a field like aviation, where lives depended on split-second decisions. Knowing that others saw him as reliable gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe that's why he'd chosen to become an instructor, to pass on the skills and lessons he'd learned over the years. Flying wasn't just about taking off and landing. It was about responsibility, discipline, and resilience. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he found himself standing beside the Cessna 172 he'd flown the previous night. Technicians were inspecting it thoroughly, ensuring it was airworthy after the hijacking. He ran a hand along the fuselage, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. This plane had carried him through chaos and back to safety. It was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of survival. "You okay?" a voice asked behind him. It was another instructor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a weathered face. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." "Just thinking," the pilot admitted, "about everything that happened, about what comes next." The older man nodded knowingly. "That's normal. Stuff like this changes people. But you handled it better than most, hell, better than anyone I know." "Thanks," the pilot replied, appreciating the sentiment. "I guess I just needed a reminder that things will go back to normal eventually." "Oh, they will," the instructor said with a grin. "But don't kid yourself. You're gonna have a hell of a story to tell your students." The comment made him laugh, a genuine, hearty laugh that echoed across the empty airstrip. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of lightness. Teaching had always been about more than flying techniques. It was about instilling confidence, problem-solving skills, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Last night's events had reinforced all those lessons in ways he never could have imagined. In the weeks that followed, life gradually returned to its usual rhythm. The hijackers were charged with multiple offenses, and investigators uncovered a sprawling network of smugglers operating across several states. Authorities credited the pilot's actions with dismantling a key link in the chain, preventing untold amounts of illegal activity. Media coverage died down, replaced by newer stories, but the impact of that night remained etched in the minds of those who'd witnessed it firsthand. For the pilot, the experience became a turning point. He threw himself into his work with renewed passion, mentoring aspiring aviators with a focus on both technical skill and mental fortitude. His classes grew popular, drawing students eager to learn from someone who'd faced real-world danger and emerged victorious. He didn't seek fame or recognition, but he embraced the opportunity to inspire others. One evening, as he watched a student land smoothly after their first solo flight, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Up in the sky, surrounded by endless possibilities, anything seemed achievable. Fear might always linger on the edges, but courage and preparation could overcome it every time. Standing there, bathed in the golden light of sunset, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Life was unpredictable, full of challenges and uncertainties, but it was also beautiful, filled with moments worth fighting for. And as long as he kept flying, both literally and figuratively, he knew he'd be ready for whatever came next.